Brother George, and thanks to all of you. This is great fun to talk about this, great fun to be involved in this research in and around our historical work and to bring it to some kind of a presentation at this retreat. I'll try not to drop everything on the floor in the process. So you see my title. Hopefully you can enjoy it as much as I do. There's nothing like an academic colon. Every once in a while on titles, I really like to go 19th century. So, first, let me say what we've already said, many of us together, and that is that I'm frankly quite happy to be alive this year with all of you, and happy to be here in Pittsburgh or anywhere else with all of you. And given the last 2 years, I don't want to take any of that for granted. Hope we never will again. These have been traumatic times for us, yet fascinating times, I think also, we need to say. I think we're living through a generational crisis that has shaken many of us absolutely to the core, but crisis and change often go together, don't they? And as we begin, I want us to consider also in the order that we're in the midst of an historically significant time for the order, but I'm not going to encroach on Sister Kimberly's presentation, so I'm going to let her have that. So I'll go do some digging around the foundations today, which is what I intend to do in my work. But I think, again, we're in the midst of an historically significant time, historical change time for the order because of COVID. And we'll be working that out, I think, over time. For now, understand that I make it in dialogue with items in the first two, the title is in dialogue with items in the first two versions of the Order's Rule, 1946 and 1951. But first, just some thoughts on the Our Story Project and the wider historical work of the Order of St. Luke. I'll talk a little more specifically tomorrow afternoon. I think it's tomorrow afternoon, isn't it? Yes. The days kind of start rolling together when we're together. I don't know if that happens to you when you're on retreat or not. It does for me. But I'll talk specifically about the Our Story Project tomorrow, but just a few things about the philosophy that I carry into it now, because that informs really everything I'm doing here. So I began work on the Our Story Project in 2017. And have worked on it in and around my teaching, my cat herding as chapel elder for Perkins. That's the best way I can think of in terms of running best image for running a seminary chapel program is cat herding. To a good end, but nevertheless it is cat herding. Those of you who've done it understand what I'm talking about. But in and around that and my other scholarly projects, but with a lot greater focus in the last year. And I'm very happy about that. My recent appointment by Sister Abbott as historian, kind of adding that title to the Our Story Project title, is to me an invitation to vocational focus in service of this order, but it's not a sudden infusion of knowledge. So that I've been given the title historian doesn't mean that now suddenly I know all the answers to all of the questions. Rather, I will claim to know what I know and what I think I know and what I am learning. Those things I know, but all of it is under construction. I don't know everything, and there is so much more to know, which I think is key to any kind of historical investigation we may want to do about matters related to order in church, or really, quite frankly, almost anything else we would want to study. I think we always have to realize there is more to learn, and everything is subject to revision, I think, in terms of conclusions that we might draw. But I have accepted this call to service, to serve as historian, and I continue in the work of the Our Story Project. All right. And speaking of stories and historical matters, I told you I would show this picture of a day when I had more hair than I have now, and it was of a different hue, by and large, than it is now. This is actually a photo of me, as it says, from the Redlands, California retreat, the first one we did there in October of 1999 at the El Carmelo. retreat center. Lovely, lovely place with that great picture window in the background. I'm actually standing here behind the altar, and you can see a little bit over my shoulders the mountain view. This is actually a picture of me that that was taken, interestingly enough, on the day that I learned that I'd made the short list for my current job at Perkins. So I was there, and my mother called Margie, who had the cell phone. There was one that we had between us in 1999, called the cell phone. The car phone, really, but the cell phone, and said, Robin Lovin is trying to get a hold of you. He had called me in Roaring Spring, Pennsylvania, where we were living at the time, and before the day was out, I had called him and found out that I had made the short list, which was a cherished memory to me that had happened in the midst of all of you. On that day, in fact, we were talking about catechumenate at that retreat in 1999, and I had just finished a sermon that day on vocation, and my own sense of vocation as a liturgical scholar. It's over. I get the call from Robin Love, and it was just too much to realize. Anyway, that was well before the Our Story Project and my appointment as historian. But as I look at this picture and think of that story that I just told you, I remember the old high school quip made, you probably heard it, you maybe even said it yourself, about the seemingly ancient history teacher, of whom they said, he doesn't teach history, he remembers it. and sometimes I fear that it could be trending that way with me. He doesn't write history for the order, he remembers it. And part of that's true, but there's a lot more that I don't remember, and that I wasn't around for, and that we need to investigate, and it's great fun to do. All right. So, just a few thoughts as we kind of round out some of the philosophy of this project. I'm calling this Thoughts on the Our Story Project and the Wider Historical Work of the Order of St. Luke. I want to link this to the idea of how, or the importance of historical work within the liturgical movement. And the dynamics, my French isn't that great, but I'm going to give it a shot. Ressourcement, I think. How did I do? All right? Yeah. All right. The ressourcement. Along with the temptations of such. Ressourcement essentially means back to the sources. All right? And it speaks to an interest in history that is characteristic of the liturgical movement, as I have said. And not surprisingly then, it is an impulse characteristic of the order, because we are kind of in that stream of being interested and part of in the liturgical movement, and actually in ways being part of it ourselves. We carry within us that interest in history. But I want to talk about that just a little bit. In his 2005 vice presidential address to the North American Academy of Liturgy, Lutheran scholar Thomas Schatauer wrote, quote, "For the liturgical movement, the historical pattern and practice of Christian worship have been the principal source for reimagining the assembly and shaping the practice of worship." Get this next part. "The distinctive aim in this recovery of historic practice has been to renew the church as a distinctive community in Christ, witnessing to and participating in God's purpose for the world." So, the focus on history is never just history for history's sake, although we want to be accurate, and that's important when we talk about what happened and why it happened. Accuracy does matter. Getting the best historical reading on anything matters. But the focus is toward renewal. So, as an example, we don't do, the Easter Vigil, for instance, which has been recovered in our midst, and many of us have participated in it in various ways. We don't do the Easter Vigil simply because it is an ancient practice. It is that. Yes. And we want to learn from the ancient practice, but we don't do it simply because it's old. than people in an earlier part of the church used it. Rather, we recover the Easter Vigil because to us it speaks of something true and right. The dynamics of it are spiritually true and helpful to us in our journey. They make sense to us. And we're also we're not bound to historical practice either. If there is a historical practice that is problematic, we can revisit it. We are always the heirs and the continuing discerners of that which the church will do. So, even if the church didn't have much in the way of the ordination of women for its first 19 centuries or so, that really doesn't matter. That's historically perhaps interesting. We may even want to ask, why was it? But we can change that. We can do things a different way, and that applies in other ways as well. So history never boxes us in that regard, but it is a source of insight. And again, we want to be as accurate about it as we can be. I talk about temptations. There have also been well-noted temptations related to this impulse to doing history and as part of the liturgical movement. One of the temptations is the temptation to oversimplify the narrative historically. Or the narratives, we might better say. We're always getting to a better place when we start saying not of the narrative, but of the narratives. And just even using the plural takes one to a way better place than simply speaking of there being a narrative as if there was just one. There's never just one narrative about almost anything. But there has been and is the temptation to Romanticism. We do this in terms of studying of early church sources. We do it as Wesleyans. Right? This look somehow for a golden age of anything, is a temptation. It's a temptation that causes us to hear some sources and tend to overlook others that don't fit the more romantic vision that we may be carrying. There can be a tendency to privilege some texts, some ecclesial perspectives, some gendered perspectives, more than may be warranted. Right? Speaking of historical texts, there may be a tendency to think of the first apology of Justin Martyr, for instance, as being more important than it really was. Okay? It's important to us. Now, and that can be enough to say it's important to us, but maybe we shouldn't claim too much about what the early church was doing. Again, it's another one of those things when I'm reviewing papers. Anytime someone says the early church, I say, which? Which source? What place? Right? Again, that's kind of an example of Romanticism. The apostolic tradition. Not of Hippolytus anymore. We're not saying that, but the apostolic tradition. Maybe, overrated in terms of how much emphasis we give to it. James White made the famous quip that maybe that the apostolic tradition was taken more seriously in the 20th century than it ever was in the 3rd. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. And again, also a tendency to privilege some gendered perspectives more than others, and so on. So that tendency to overstate the case sometimes, we need to be aware of that. Thus, we have needed scholars like Paul Bradshaw, who said essentially about this dynamic, not so fast. Just be careful, slow down, don't claim too much. Bradshaw wrote in his The Search for the Origins of Christian Worship, a book that everybody ought to read, if you haven't yet. Bradshaw says, historians of early liturgy have traditionally tended to show a greater degree of naivete in relation to their primary sources than have their counterparts in biblical studies. He's basically saying liturgical scholars have tended to be a tad naive, about reading resources and claiming too much, about how important they were. And biblical scholars tend to be a tad more suspicious, of texts. And he sort of is saying, maybe we should be too. He goes on and says, liturgical historians need to adopt the hermeneutics of suspicion. In particular, we need to be aware of being too ready to conclude that authoritative sounding statements are always genuinely authoritative. In other words, if they say, don't do this, that may mean that a lot of people, in fact, were doing it. Okay. All right. Another person who takes up a similar dynamic is Susan White, longtime professor at Bright Divinity in Fort Worth. In her A History of Women in Worship, Susan White calls us to a similar dynamic. She calls it looking for the shadows and silhouettes of classic rubrics and narratives. For example, what is the shadow behind a prohibition? Right. So because of all that, because of Bradshaw, White, and similar dynamics in liturgical scholarship, reading sources has become more complicated. And it should be more complicated. And there's more work on the way. There's more work in that way, in making them more complicated. But I think there's also deeper justice in all of this, in pushing to a deeper reading of the sources, sometimes a suspicion of it. This could apply to our work together, in terms of our own historical work in the order, and I'll suggest that perhaps it does in some cases. Again, this is a dynamic that's at work in much of our work in and around history. To illustrate this summer I went to see a movie. I just kind of stumbled onto a movie. Maybe some of you saw it. Have you seen Summer of Soul? I've given you a book assignment, Bradshaw. This is a movie assignment. This is one you need to see, I think, if you haven't. This is a documentary put together by one Amir Khalid Thompson. If you watch The Tonight Show, you know him better there as Questlove, the drummer, right? This was Questlove's work entitled Summer of Soul. So let me tell you a little bit about what I learned and what I had confirmed to me in seeing this movie this year. So 1969 was the Summer of Soul, according to the documentary. In 1969, I was 11 years old, but remember a thing or two about it. Some of you were a little older than that in 1969 and may remember a thing or two more. I often reference 1969, have a little fun with this with my students, because 1969, at Advent, was the first release of the 3-year lectionary. Advent 1969, in year B. Kid you not. I wrote my, when I have a question about matters Catholic, Paul Turner is always on my speed dial, right? So I corresponded with Paul. I said, Paul, what's up with this? I mean, was it 68 and I've just been saying it wrong? And he said, no, it was 69. He talked with me about being in the kind of the equivalent of a Catholic youth praise band at the time. It's kind of a folk mass group that they had, where they met at the one girl's house every week and earnestly tried to find songs that would match the lessons. Okay? And they got to they suddenly realized that what they were doing wasn't matching what the priest was reading. Guess who was right? Not the priest. Yeah. He said, I thought year A would be a good place to start. Well, might have been, but they started in year B, and I asked Paul, what's up with that? He says, well, they had hoped to release it by Advent of 68. Didn't get it done, imagine that. Church project not getting done in time. And so it got released in May of 69, and so they started with year B. that year. So anyway, so I tell the story. I talk about 1969 because of the release of the lectionary. But there's other stuff that happened in 1969. Pretty momentous year. Moon landing. Woodstock. There's at least one of our number who was there. Not me as an 11-year-old. Also, the Mets, of all people, won the World Series that year. Who expected the Mets to win the World Series in '69? So that's kind of always been my list, those things in the 3-year election year. But like many, I didn't know about the Harlem Cultural Festival that took place in 1969 because the videotapes documenting it had almost been forgotten. Sat in an attic for about 40 years. Could have been lost easily. Could have just been tossed easily. But finally someone realized what they were. Thompson got a hold of them, made this documentary. And the story is now available to us about this wonderful event that took place in, now it's Marcus Garvey Park in New York City. And story now available to us, but it was awaiting rediscovery all the time. So I think when I think of what's available to us in terms of the order, in terms of stories, in terms of narratives, in terms of stuff, I'm going to have that image from the movie of that closet full of tapes, right, that nobody knew about. And one of those, and there's stuff there always to be discovered, even about many of the narratives that we have told. So again, we want to make sure we don't oversimplify, and we want to make sure that we want to believe that there may always be more about any narrative we are telling in the order. Okay. So with that in mind, let me get a drink of water. Feast your eyes on the 1946 rule of life that we talked about briefly, or referenced briefly yesterday. Those are the first 4 parts of it. You'll notice various things about it. Emphasis on sacraments. Yes. Worship is the greatest experience possible to man. 1946, right? Authorized orders of worship in the Book of Worship of the Methodist Church. I'll show you what we mean by that. Focus on baptismal formation in and around confirmation. St. Luke the Physician shows up. Good. Faithful and systematic. As an outward symbol of our dedication, we will wear clerical garb when engaged in the business of our calling. So in honor of them, I had to put, I was going to wear black clerics today. I thought that was maybe a little over the top, so I just wanted a little less severe with the white. Pledge our fullest allegiance to the Methodist Church and its bishops. There you go. So but before I go any further, I want to give credit to the dissertation title that you see referenced here at the bottom of the page. David Ralph Baines, Harvard dissertation, 1969. The Liturgical Impulse in Mid-20th Century American Mainline Protestantism, done at Harvard Divinity. David Ralph Baines, he's someone you ought to know about. He wrote a full chapter on the order, 47 pages, on the order, titled Pastors Rediscovering the Church, a case study of the Order of St. Luke, 1946 to 1962. David Baines' dissertation, one you ought to know about. Baines has been a religious studies professor at Samford, S-A-M-F-O-R-D, Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, since 1999. I first met Professor Baines at the Mercersburg Society and see him from time to time at North American Academy of Liturgy. He's not a member of the Order of St. Luke, but we should get to know him and find out what else he knows. There are some other dissertations and dissertation writers out there whom we should know as well. Particularly Robert Pfeiffer and his How Contemporary Liturgies Evolve, the Revision of United Methodist Liturgical Texts, 1968 to 1988. Robert Pfeiffer. Notre Dame PhD, 1993, same decade, in the 90s. It's not about the Order of St. Luke, but a number of Order of St. Luke folk come into play. Hoyt was interviewed. Dawn, you were interviewed for this dissertation as well. But also there's correspondence from our friends Lee Cunningham. Our friend Lee Cunningham shows up at various points in some of the footnotes. And also a gentleman by the name of M. Lawrence Snow, brother M. Lawrence Snow, of the Order of St. Luke, who Snow was central to the formation of the United Methodist Church marriage rite, you should know, and also a member of the Order of St. Luke. But this is another dissertation that folks interested in kind of the stream we have been flowing in ought to know about. Pfeiffer's dissertation, How Contemporary Liturgies Evolve. I don't know why it's never been published. Just hasn't been. But it's available from the dissertation brokers, as it were. Pfeiffer, at one point, was in fact a member of the order. He shows up in the minutes of the Stella Niagara executive meeting, held in May 1987, listed simply as communications. It doesn't say what communications did, but he's listed in the minutes as communications. It doesn't say communications officer, just says Robert Pfeiffer, communications. The last I can find of him had him at Mount Zion United Church of Christ in Ephrata, Pennsylvania in 2014. The trail has run cold. I don't know what that means. He's about my age. We were contemporaries in the Central Pennsylvania Conference. I've reached out to my best Lancaster County UCC contact, but haven't been able to dig up anything on Pfeiffer in terms of where he may be or anything. He was another, again, of the Central Pennsylvania Conference United Methodist Church crowd, along with Romy Marshall and others. I don't see any of the, well, there are some contemporary Central Pennsylvania Conference folks, but there were, that was Romy's home conference, by the way, among others. But in the end, that Central PA was his home conference as well as mine. But anyway, what do we notice here in this rule? Several things. I'll flip back to it a little bit. There we go. Read down through some of it. Several things. One thing I hope you notice is it's entirely what we would now call commentary. And I've wondered about this, and I don't have anything to conclude on that yet. And it may be, one of my speculations, this is only a very thin hypothesis at this point. My speculation on that is perhaps because the rule did not take a ritual form at that point. I don't think there was not a profession service, we don't think, at that point. So there wasn't the need for there to be shorter pieces in it. And it wouldn't for a while. Brother Dwight and I were just having a conversation. I know the 1988 book had a profession service in it, and there is a 1982 book out there. Anybody got it, by the way? Check your stuff. Yeah, because I don't, and I would like to have it. Maybe if you could even scan it for me, Brother French, if you find it.
That's not the dark blue one.
No, the dark blue is 88.
Okay.
88 and 88 was a version of the dark, but that's the second edition.
Yeah.
And the third edition is 1994, which had some changes, not a lot, but some. And then there wasn't another until 2012 in the red book. Right. But note the name also. Rule of life and service, which has remained consistent for our whole history. Notice the focus on sacramental praxis in a Lucan mode with formation as primary value. It's all there. Presumption, of course, that the members were Methodist. Presumption that they were ordained. Wasn't even questioned. Right, at that point. They were, of course, all men, because of those presumptions. One of the things I would like to find out, I've said to Sister Abbott and also Sister Jeanette, that one of the things I'd like to see us do is come up with a comprehensive list of all the people who've ever been members of the order. I think it's doable. It would always be under construction. It would never be perfect, but I think there are ways we could begin to work on that. One of the things I would like to know is who was the first female member, which is very interesting to find out who it was and when it was that there was the first female member. Pretty sure I know the first female general officers. I think I'm willing at this point to say it was Karen McMartin in 1989. But I don't know who the first member was. But I'd like to have the list if we could come up with it. Also, there's the reference to clerical garb, but it's not defined. Just clerical garb, right? Okay. Now let's go on. Oh yes. And just in case you were wondering, so I was talking about this with the Koinonia chapter. Some of this I was testing it out on with them. And Brother Aiden went running for his 1964 Book of Worship. I said, no, not 64. Book of Worship in that original rule is talking about the 44 Book of Worship for voluntary and optional use in the church. You should, and just for fun, so that's what it looks like. Just for fun, that's the table of contents. I can't read that very well. That's the best I could do with this. One of the things you'll notice in this is no basic pattern. Hoyt was probably still in college, I think, probably in 44. So we're a long way from that at this point. And you'll also notice down here, Order for Administration of the Sacrament of the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion comes about page 200. Okay, so just understand, kind of where we are. It was brand new, however, and I think based on what's said about it in the rule, one can imagine their hopes for it and their emotional involvement in it. In the success of this book. Back to Susan White's insight about reading the silhouettes, right, of strongly worded statements. I think you might posit, from that insight that they were frustrated at its not being used, widely in the church, even with the limitations that we would now see in it. But we've got to make sure we don't just read it anachronistically. I think it's fair to say that they had great hopes for the possibility of what this book could do, even though, again, we see its limitations now. All right. Now let's go forward just a little a couple other things I want to say back about this. Understand also that the rule 1946, and this book, which was published even 2 years before that, in 44, the first rule of the order was 17 years before Vatican II. Right, so just try to imagine that. 17 years before Vatican II, and particularly the publication of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So this is very early, particularly early for Protestants, to be discussing some of these things that were discussed. It's 15 years. The rule was 15 years before James F. White landed at Perkins School of Theology, with the beginning title Assistant Professor of Worship and Preaching. Arguably, understand the arguably, remember back to what I said earlier, that all these points need to be investigated further. But arguably the first person to bear that title in the Methodist Seminary in the United States. It has been said, perhaps the first person to bear that title in a Protestant seminary in the U.S. That's the part I'm not quite ready to what's that?
I think the Lutherans were
probably so, but I think for the Methodists, I think White was first at Perkins, hired by Joseph Quillian, who was involved very heavily ultimately in the 64 Book of Worship. So again, I place this before you just to give you some context as to where liturgical scholarship and practice stood when the order was formed. Which again, we should understand that. No basic pattern, Lord's Supper not the default pattern yet, and not even really thought of much yet. Okay, so this is the rule of life and service then in 1951. A few steps down the road. And I think, Sister Elizabeth, this is the one that I think this was still in force.
That looks like the...
Yeah, in 58, in the one that you saw. It's beginning to look a little bit more like ours now, as Sister Abbott pointed out yesterday. You can see now it's got the shorthand titles along with the commentary. You can see some that look pretty much like they do now. Right? We live for the Church of Jesus Christ. We promote the public worship of the church. We say corporate now, but nevertheless, about the same thing. I'll show you a couple more here and we'll come back. Magnify the sacraments. Again, that'll also be pretty much what we say now. Seek the devout life, which we have, as you said, updated to the sacramental life. But this other one, we hold the validity of the ministerial office. Let's look at that just a little bit. Although priesthood is of the believers, so they've got that language in there. Its highest act, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, is rightly administered only by representatives chosen of God and men. Literally. Right. Their office is a special and divine vocation marked by ordination. As an additional and outward symbol of this life call and our dedication insofar as it is possible, we will wear recognizable clerical garb. They've amped it up just a little bit. It was clerical garb before. It is now recognizable clerical garb in the second version of the rule. When engaged in the business of the church, and we will wear at least a pulpit gown at morning worship and sacramental services. Okay. So again, presumptions remain. Ordained Methodists and seminarians, although the rule doesn't say that, ordained Methodists and thereby men, and the male language is actually intensified, frankly, in this one from the 1946 piece. There is no call to service language because they didn't need it. It probably didn't seem necessary. The call was to a particular understanding of ordained ministry. End of topic. Pretty much, I think it's fair to say. So that was kind of presumed, I think, in this rule. But the clerical garb thing, and recognizable clerical garb. So, are they talking clergy collars here? Perhaps so, but they don't quite say it. They just don't quite say it. How's that?
They know better.
Yes, right. I think you're right. Brother Don. Yeah. We'll come back to that. By the way, here's another one. You should just see what the versicle looked like. This was volume 1, 2. So kind of mimeographed. This is from the copy at Perkins. But they all kind of look that way. This is volume 1, number 2, Pentecost 1951. And actually, to find the rule, you've got to go across 3 different pages. I think page 3, 8, and 10, maybe it was. So I'm just showing you page 3 here. But that's what it looked like. The graphics would improve. But before long, but this is what it looked like at that time. But again, as to the clerical garb thing, I think we do well to remember again Susan White at this point, what she claims about reading the shadows and silhouettes of practices and rubrics and strongly worded statements, such as wearing recognizable clerical garb. I think there's an argument there somewhere that someone says clerical garb wasn't enough, it ought to be recognizable now. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect that there was a conversation there. And again, they tend to suggest counter practices and arguments lying somewhere not far below the surface. And thus I present to you photos of Romy Marshall. Now, as Brother Hoyt said it 25 years ago now, amazing. But as Brother Hoyt said it 25 years ago, it's been said both Romy and Rami. Right? David Bort corrected me to say it should be Rami. I'm not sure. I've heard even people who knew him say Romy, so pay your money, take your choice, maybe on that one. He may well have answered to both, I'm not sure. Anyway, here he is, Rami P. Marshall, 1901 to 1985, first president of the order, was a Central Pennsylvania ministerial colleague of my grandfather and father. I guess technically of me for a little while, though he was retired by the time I came along. I regret deeply that I didn't get to know him, didn't know I should know him at that time, and it's a regret that I carry that I didn't get to know him. My mother recalled him to me as dapper. Always having the little mustache, always dressed properly, but I have not heard her yet mention collars in terms of Brother Romy. All right, so first president of the order, but we don't see a photo of him in a collar. Although I grant that such a lack of such photos at this point is light years from definitive. You know, I have these two pictures of Brother Romy. But here's a research project for someone. Find us a photo of Romy Marshall in a clerical collar. It may be out there. I just haven't seen it yet. I'd like to find a picture of Brother Romy in a clerical collar. Does it exist? Not sure. I've got more research projects for you and questions that you can take up if you're willing to do it. More on that tomorrow. But photos or not, and again, this is kind of an early and a later photo. I don't know. I know when the 1985 photo appeared. It was in the Conference Journal. I don't know when that picture was taken. The one on the right, one on the left, I do know. This actually is from the article in The Pastor, his Wesley versus Methodism article. This was the photo of Romy that showed up in 1945. Neither one of them has a collar. Again, it doesn't necessarily prove anything, but I find it interesting. You know, so far I have not found a photo of him in a collar. But there was other ambivalence expressed by Brother Marshall about collars. So you hear this, you know, beneath the surface, this argument going, regardless of what the rule said about recognizable clerical garb and whether that meant collars, I think it probably did, although they couldn't quite come to say it. Some fun stuff. I love reading Romy Marshall. If you have not had the chance to read any of his stuff, do it. We maybe ought to collect some of the articles. We've got some. We've actually we republished. We got permission to republish Wesley versus Methodism and Sacramental Life in 2006. But he's really fun to read. You know, rather folksy. So here, this is a word from the president that appeared in the versicle in Epiphany 1954. Quote, I just love reading this stuff. They think we're a bunch of cranks who insist on being peculiar. Really? You know, wearing our collars backward and imitating Rome, or at least the Episcopalians. Here's the language again. He goes on to insist that most members of the order are outstanding men in Methodism. They do not all wear clerical collars, and many of them are not much concerned about architectural uniformity. I'll get back to that question in a minute. But they do believe in Methodism as an evangelistic agency and as part of the ecumenical church. Interesting combo there. The evangelistic agency and part of the ecumenical church. So the architectural uniformity piece, that was a major emphasis in the Cambridge Candid Society, as James White outlines in his dissertation on that topic. And arguments about proper church architecture often went hand in hand with other high church emphases, especially in that particular time. And we actually take up some of that, including James White and Susan White in their church architecture book, which we have. I don't know if we still have it in print as an OSL title or not. Good. Talk about the split chancel and how that was really a 19th century innovation, thought by many to be ancient, not, but nevertheless, there were many who would argue quite strenuously about what makes for a proper church chancel, altar area, and that was, would have been quite in the, in conversations you might have heard at that time, especially from persons who leaned in a more high church kind of way. He proceeds to a somewhat, one of my favorite Romy Marshall pieces, however, I mean this one, but also a 1960 piece, edition of his The Liturgical Question Box, in the versicle Advent of 1960. He wrote once again in response to a question about the proper form of clerical collars for Protestant ministers. It kept coming up. He proceeds to a somewhat defensive discussion of the order and clergy collars, saying, quote, "You can't spot a member of the order by looking for collars. At a conference recently, a non-member said, 'There comes a St. Luker,' pointing to a black-garbed man and clerically collared brother with a pious expression. "No," said my friend, "he thinks we're crazy." Then he pointed to a jolly young man in a tweed suit who was holding forth under a tree. "There's one of our fellows," he said, "but he isn't advertising it." Still the jolly young man, under the tree, but not the collar. So Marshall goes on to argue for the wearing of clerical garb, but it seems a tad half-hearted, quite frankly, because I never saw him say, "You ought to wear clerical collars." Don't see him saying that, interestingly enough. And he was the president. He goes on insisting that Methodist ministers should at least on Sunday not look like golf pros. Basically, what he said. So again, golf professionals. Yes, right, right. But I hear an ambivalence in Romy, and not necessarily in shadow. So whither these brothers then, and indeed what to make of it all. First of all, I want to just acknowledge again how difficult it can be hearing some of the presumptions that were expressed here for us in 2021, hearing some of this. In their defense, it all came prior to the baptismal ecclesiology so wonderfully expressed in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So in some ways it wasn't a conversation that they had necessarily readily available to them. But again, they thought very, very much in terms of a male-centered church, and it can get worse. And so I'll give you another example, but my thought about all that is, we might assume, I think that their spiritual DNA remains within the order. There's some ways in which you can't outrun your DNA, right? In terms of kind of the presumptions that a group can have, and that they can easily return to if they're not careful. I'm starting to preach here just a little bit. But that given the work of the Spirit, DNA does not entirely determine destiny. Even if there was a tendency to think of a male-centered church, that's not where we have to stay. And we can, by the aid of the Spirit, outgrow that. Whether we've outgrown it, I want to be careful. I think we are outgrowing it. But the work of inclusion and imagining a wider church never ends. That even if we begin to get female leadership, a better understanding of that, there are other things I think we could name them, and we'll continue to be able to name, right? Over time. So I want to put in the however. So I wrote an article in 1968, or 1998, I'm writing 68 when I was 10, but I wrote an article in 1998 that appeared in Methodist History, which was the title that you see here, Catholic Yearnings, the Discussion of Apostolic Succession and Ordained Ministry in the Versicle. Okay. Versicle is published from 1951 through 1965. Ran across Brother Lawrence Guderian, in that work, whom some of you may have known, was our correspondent to the 1956 General Conference, held in Minneapolis, by the way, okay, interestingly enough. He went there hoping for something that would help Methodism on its way to reunion of orders with Canterbury, and came away disappointed. Not the first time, of course, for that disappointment, but nevertheless came away disappointed. But the shape of the expression of that disappointment is very difficult to hear, which is why we need to hear it. All right? And I invite you to recall, again, that full clergy rights for women, for Methodist women, was passed at that General Conference in 1956. Our correspondent seemed disappointed. He writes, saying, "Full clergy rights for women gives us another hurdle to cross in our eventual recognition of orders with our Protestant Episcopal Church, sister church." He mused. "One wonders if the historical reasons for keeping the priesthood a male calling were surveyed at all." That was from us. We need to know that. And we need to come to terms with that as part of the order's history that appeared in our official publication in the versicle in 1956. It's not easy, but again, I think we need to know that was there and we published it. Okay. All right. So let me move on, if I can, from that. There are, of course, competing narratives at various points in our history. I expect to find more. Further narratives of spiritual progress rarely move in a straight line. They tend to meander about. We see progress, we see hope, we get setbacks. We have great hope. We're devastated then by some decisions. Again, that's kind of the way it often tends to unfold. And the Spirit converts. The Spirit changes us over time. David Baines reports that in the 1964 version of the rule, which I think was the next one, so you have 46, 51, 64, they excised all references to clerical collars, or recognizable clerical garb. Some, like Thorvald Torgerson, there's that name for the first time, Thorvald Torgerson believed that they were important, yet given the explosion they sometimes created, he did not want to see the work of, quote, liturgical renewal and reform to be sacrificed for a collar. Ah, Brother Thorvald. In my interview with his ministerial daughter, get that? In my interview with his ministerial daughter, the Reverend Jennifer Lavallo, she said that Brother Thorvald would wear his collar even when the youth group went on a camping trip. Out of his tent, he would come with it on. There's so much more I want to learn about Thorvald. As to competing narratives, though, come back to an earlier thought about histories to be uncovered and learned. Doing so can be challenging, even precarious. So I want to show you another one. You may have heard of this one. So this is what I call the narrative of the prayer book and the order of the post-Vatican II liturgical movement, which is a narrative that we will hear. This is from the minutes of the Executive Council, May 2nd, 1984, held at Lovely Lane United Methodist Church, Baltimore, Maryland, as recorded and submitted by Thorvald, who was Chancellor, that's the title at the time, perhaps even from his typewriter, probably from his typewriter. So I've actually cut them out and given them to you here as they appeared. So you see who was present. Cliff Field, we'll hear him. Robert Arnold, Tim Crouch, Craig Bennett, Emily Bird, Michael O'Donnell, Thorvald, David Bort arrived at 2 o'clock. So it says. The meeting was called to order at 9:50 following a 7 a.m. Eucharist and breakfast at Lovely Lane Church in Baltimore. A bunch of other businesses reported. Thorwald kept very tight notes, which I wish at this point he had said more, but he was taking the notes. So here's what we have about what happened in 1984. Emma O'Donnell raised strong objections to content of the morning Eucharist and sermon, which led to a protracted and heated discussion, no action taken. That's the report. That's the footprint of that conversation. We'll talk a little bit about that. So, what to make of it all? I joined the order, as you heard from Brother George, in 1991, and began attending council meetings not long after that in 1992. Louisville was my first one, my first council meeting. It was Brother Brent's first council meeting too, I believe.
I didn't have a Cadillac.
What's that?
I didn't have a Cadillac.
I know, I did. That's another story, so I'm not telling you now. I did. My rental car, It's not what I ordered, but it's what I got. Anyway. I didn't know how to work the windows either. Stop. I got to stop or I'll tell that story. Anyway, this story from 1984 was still quite fresh. In 1992, when I first began to be around people who had experienced some of it. I have, in fact, my handwritten notes on a conversation that I had with Brother Timothy dated October 20, 1994, which was at the time of the first Pittsburgh retreat. So I had a conversation with Timothy about this, and even though this was a long way from my being appointed to this story, I thought, I want to write that down. So I have handwritten notes of the conversation I had with Brother Timothy. According to him, the 84 breakfast service was attended by about 400 people. 400, he says. That's what he said. That's what he told me. And was supposed to be free of charge, but Lovely Lane asked for $2 a head. That was the first problem. Okay. Thorwald preached, but as Brother Timothy said, as an outsider. That was his description. That is, as an outsider to the United Methodist Church liturgical renewal process, which was then at a critical juncture. I've heard other narratives along the same line, and they speak to an event of critical importance regarding the ethos of the order and also the shape of our work together. But I want to just hit the pause button a little bit about that and make a broader assertion about that. And that's this. And I think this is something, again, that's in our DNA, and we need to simply be aware of. Because this can work against our life together, I think, if we're not careful about this. That is, I think it's fair, I'm coming to the conclusion that the order, our order, was born within a dynamic of passionately contesting the shape of worship and sacramental life within Methodism. No, the first article, we often talk of the opening salvo, as it were, that led to the Order of St. Luke was Romy's article in The Pastor entitled, get it, Wesley versus Methodism. So, there's a sense of contesting worship life and Methodism from the very beginning. And such a dynamic can be both gift and calling, as well as problem. It can also mean that you end up at various junctures in the order's history of having winners and losers. Okay? If you win the argument, if you lose the argument of what's being contested, and I don't want to get into all those stories, but we might name them, just talking among ourselves. Given the shape of worship and sacramental life to which the order was and has been committed, by the rule in its various iterations, remember back to 1946, Book of Worship, right, named there. The 1984 clash may have been inevitable because of some of those loyalties that had been formed in key people around various ritual practices. And again, I think, I told you the story about Brother Lawrence I lay this before you because I think any family that's going to take itself seriously and learn from it has to understand the arguments within the family and the shape that those arguments sometimes take. And again, I think the contesting of worship life is part of who we are. It just is. Has been from the very beginning. I think it's in the DNA for what the order is. And we just need to learn how to manage that. Need to continue to learn. I think we need to be continually vigilant. That's why I use the DNA piece there, because I think we can go back to being to having winners and losers, around arguments when sometimes it's not necessary to have that. Notice also that at the time of the 1984 controversy, again, there was the old rite, the 1552 rite, still was listed by the discipline as the official ritual of the church. The supplemental worship resources were permitted. They were encouraged. They were enshrined in the discipline in terms of the board of discipleship, which should be working on these things. But if you were defending an older rite, you actually were standing on solid disciplinary ground at that point. I just think we need to wrap our minds around that as a canonical reality to all of this. So, back to a question that I continue to have. What actually happened at Lovely Lane on the 2nd of May, 1784? What I'm willing to say at this point was it was a decisive turning point for the order. That is absolutely indisputable, that it was, whatever happened that morning. But I have to say, as I write here, that the liturgical scholar in me is frustrated by a lack of key artifacts.
Yeah, we don't know what happened.
That's exactly it. There is not an order of worship. I keep asking, we need descriptions from other people as to what was said, what happened. I don't know if we can get them, but I keep looking. I keep wondering if they're in the archives. Maybe they are. Maybe there's an order of worship somewhere. Maybe we need to find other people. I'm going to say it here. Emily Bird is still alive. She hasn't been a member of the order for a long time. Maybe she ought to be interviewed. Remember I told you about that? Suggested that. Just to get her her take on what she remembers of if she would allow us to do that. Again, all of that is by permission. But
And what about Michael O'Donnell?
Michael's story is very similar to Timothy's. Again, I've asked him, and I can't get from him, much as I love Mike. I can't get. I get a sense of impression. Like Timothy got about Thorold preaching as an outsider, but I can't get specifics in terms of actually what prayers were used, what rite was used. That's where it gets.
What about what he objected to? I mean, his name shows up there.
Right.
Right. Well, we've talked about that. Yeah, but not French in terms of specifics. Mostly in terms of tone. Is what I'm looking for. I may never get it. We may just have to say it was a decisive argument and it was a turning point in the history of the order. We have to settle for that. But I'm not ready to settle yet. I'm not saying that anyone's is wrong in this. That's not what I'm trying to say. I would just like to have more. I want the order of worship. I want the bull. If we can find it somewhere. Yes.
I would just add that I think you should bracket that fulcrum point was also the first convocation in Jeanette, which sort of was the completion of that starting breakage.
Yep. And I'm aware of some of that too. But yes, you're right. You're right.
The first convocation was held in Jeanette, Pennsylvania in 1984, in the fall, I believe.
Right after this.
Right after that. And Craig Bennett, who was mentioned before, was sort of in the line of Torvald, went into the convention expecting to be elected president, and was not. And Michael was elected.
Yep.
And the order changed dramatically after that.
It did. But even so, and I don't want to hang up here. I want to keep going a little bit more because there's one other point that I think is very interesting. I want to show you. But I still would like to know what they actually did, in that service. That's
Sure.
That's what I hope for. May not get it, but the liturgical
Have
scholar.
you checked Lovely Lane's archives?
Good point. I haven't, but I mean that's That's all doable. Yep. So that's my continuing question. I don't think anyone that I've talked to has an order of worship. It maybe it's in Madison, and I need to go look. Yeah.
Was it about women?
Again, I don't want to speculate because I don't know. Again, I want to stick to what I know and what I can document at this point. It could have been about all that stuff. Yeah. But I want to show you something else before we run out of time. For this, because I think this is really important. In terms of, and this will get it back to a brighter place, I hope, for us. As to the order and the liturgical movement, this is a book you ought to know. Another one you ought to know. And not because it's that spectacular a book, but just in terms of who's involved with it and when. This book is very important. I knew about it, was finally able to get a copy in the last couple of years. It's long out of print. Was able to get my own copy so I can mark it, read, learn, mark, inwardly digest, all that stuff, of this particular book. So, book entitled Liturgy and Christian Unity. Joint effort of Romy Marshall, self-described as OSL, you can see, Romy P. Marshall, OSL, this is 1965, and a Jesuit scholar, Michael Taylor, published in 1965. And remember, as I say, that the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy had just been released in November of 93. Brand new. 63, what did I say? 1963. Says it right up there. And I find this somewhat stunning. Hoyt was also involved in this. Not in the book, but in some of the events that are related in the book. Let's see. So I'm not sure. It also on the back cover, in some of the blurbs of the book, it actually talks about Dr. Marshall, which I wonder about that. I'm not sure what to make of the Dr. Marshall reference that actually Taylor makes in this book. To the best of my knowledge, Romy Marshall was not a seminary graduate. You may be surprised to know that. He wasn't. He was not a seminary grad, but rather Florida Conference Course of Study. 1937. He did some work at Asbury College, undergrad, and also at a couple other colleges along the way. Could have been an honorary doctorate, but that's another question that I wonder. If so, who gave it to him? Or was that just Taylor giving him his own honorary doctorate, as it were? Don't know that. But I don't want to hang up there either. So, Romy, in this book, 1965, right after Vatican II, very, very, very early, in collaboration with the Roman Catholic. Interesting stuff. On the Sunday service for the Methodists in America, he writes in this book, Wesley, who was an indefatigable digester of all sorts of books, seems to have made some changes for the sake of change. Others were made possible to speed up the action and shorten the service. Wesley was not a liturgical scholar, else he might have taken the opportunity to revise the ritual of Holy Communion to a greater extent. There's Romy being ambivalent again. But his desire was to make Holy Communion the regular service of the Methodist worship on Sunday. This is far from an endorsement of the 1662 prayer book. Right? Really is rather faint praise, if at all, of Wesley at that point. Further remarks from Brother Romy on the revival of liturgical worship in this book, 1965, right after Vatican II, very early. I can't say that enough. This is what hit me as I was finally hit me as I was reading this book. From the standpoint of this liturgical movement, we might well formulate a definition of liturgical worship. But first of all, it would help to consider what it's not. It's not an attempt to enrich the service. Centers in the Lord's Supper. Need not be formal. Indeed, it must not be. Ooh, right. For formality is always deadly. From form there must be. The more familiar the words and actions, the easier it is for the congregation to concentrate upon the meaning of the liturgy. So right right after Vatican II and 19 years before 1984. You know, in the order. This was going on and being said by Rome. So, fascinating stuff. So as I was reading through this book, both the parts written by Marshall and the parts by Taylor, the Jesuit, Taylor is quoting extensively from the Constitution on the sacred liturgy, including some of the key paragraphs that we would recognize as key paragraphs today, such as, the liturgy is considered as an exercise of the priestly office of Jesus Christ. In the liturgy, the whole public worship is performed by the mystical body of Christ, that is, by the head and its members. And then, the one that many of us have almost memorized, the church earnestly desires that all the faithful should be led to that full conscious and active participation in liturgical celebrations which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. Such participation by the Christian people as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a redeemed people, is their right and duty by virtue of their baptism. Okay, the ones, again, we have that almost memorized. And I'm wondering, yeah, I know, right? Who hasn't read this? And then I realized, oh, this is 1965. This is to a lot of people the first time they're reading this, and in a book written by a Jesuit and a Methodist, and the Methodist being the first president of the order. I find that absolutely stunning. You know, when I think of how we were involved in that from the very beginning. So Brother Romy was part of this discussion about worship renewal, and that, even that, also in 65, 64, that is the 64 Methodist hymnal and book of worship were coming off the press, perhaps dead on arrival, as some have alleged, probably rightly so. But liturgy and Christian unity occurred by an author bearing the OSL suffix. Several years before Hoyt Hickman and James White had their legendary meeting at the coffee shop in O'Hare. 3 or 4 years. Actually, before that, Romy is writing this ringing endorsement of the liturgical movement, which very few, if any, other Methodists were talking about. But Hoyt was there too. You know, so Romy talks, I'm starting to preach, and I'll finish here. Hoyt and Romy overlap here, as Hoyt relates in his 1996 piece. Romy invited him, he was then a pastor in Erie, to attend that meeting in St. Louis in 1964. What was significant about that was the meeting in St. Louis in August of 1964, large Catholic gathering with some Protestant visitors, about 100. About 1,500 Catholics, as the count goes. 15,000, I'm sorry, not 1,500. 15,000 Catholics, maybe about 100 Protestants. Romy and Hoyt were two of them. You know, at that meeting in St. Louis. Listen to Romy's description of that. Hymns were sung enthusiastically by this congregation of more than 15,000 Catholics and some 100 Protestants, who were scattered throughout the auditorium without regard for church affiliation. The guests were able to take part in the Mass without difficulty, and some of them realized for the first time that, stripped of much of its medieval trappings and said in English, the Mass was very similar to a Protestant service of Holy Communion. But the most amazing change was seen in the use of Luther's great Reformation hymn, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, as the processional hymn of the Mass celebrated by Cardinal Ritter. Detained by an interview with a Catholic scholar, I was hurrying along the corridor when suddenly I heard the vast audience singing. For a moment I didn't realize what was happening, and when I did I could hardly believe it, for these Catholics, says Romy, were singing with fervor seldom heard in Protestant churches the grand old hymn of the Reformation. Listen, I said to my Catholic friend, do you hear what I hear? And he smiled, indeed you do, and it's no accident either. That hymn will be sung by us for many years, for it expresses the faith of a united Christian church. Now that's Romy, that's the Order of St. Luke in 1965. So yes, you had this other stream going, whatever it was, you know the old prayer books, but you had order folks in this conversation, Hoyt and Romy at least, as early as 1965. And I just want to, maybe that complicates the narrative that we've been carrying, but if it does, then it does. I just want you to see that it can be a complicated narrative. And when I read Brother Romy's reflection on what was going on in that service, it for all the world reminds me of Horace T. Allen Jr.'s near discussion of the 3-year lectionary and its ecumenical possibilities. As I related in my article for the recent Festschrift that OSS back there, that OSL Publications has done. Like there, and I reflect on Horace's later disillusionment in terms of the process of ecumenicity, both his optimism at the beginning and ultimately the disillusionment. And I want to just say, as I read it, slow down, kind friends. The journey toward liturgical renewal will be hard and it can break your heart. And it can. On the other hand, you've got to love the prophetic optimism. And once the seed of that vision takes root in the church and the order, both can change quite radically. I think I'll stop there for now because I'm tired. I might be able to bring up, we'll talk about the Our Story project on tomorrow afternoon a little bit, and I might be able to show a little bit more of some other things I have. But this is really where I wanted to get to anyway, to sort of say this. Yes?
You've mentioned several times that 84 was a big inflection point. A lot changed after 84. For those of us that wouldn't be around for a couple more years, what changed in 84? What was there before? What came after?
Yeah. Well, again, you had Methodists work. You had order people working on the hymnal. Okay, point involving that. Leadership title moves from canon to abbot in 1986, not 84, 86. Actually, is where it first shows up. Turning point in Baltimore, as I said. So the other thing that happened. Again, I'm making back and be able to talk about a few more of these things on Thursday. Wednesday, I think, in the first part of that. But the other thing was beginning of annual retreats. We were also insiders on this holy mystery, on that whole process in a number of different ways. Focus, the other thing is, I'll come back. Spring Council meeting in 1993, the decision to call ourselves brother and sister. Now the question is whether that's enough now, but that's where we were in 93. None of these discernments ever are at a stopping point. We're always on the way in all of them. But the big change, I think, in 84 ultimately was thinking of ourselves more as a religious order. And what does that mean? And so that the language was kind of followed that or led it, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, the language of what we call our officers. Eventually calling the presidential role the abbot. Does that help some?
A little bit.
Yeah, there's more we could talk about there. George, you're going to have to watch the time, my brother.
You've got about 5 more minutes for Q&A,
Okay.
or I was going to make a point.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just got a really strong aha moment, I guess, from the idea of contesting the shape of the worship and this explosive thing that happened at Lovely Lane, and how when we contest and we treat each other as enemies and winners and losers, so the reflection is, okay, so in some ways OSL won because we got the book of worship. We have this holy mystery and by water and the Spirit. It's approved officially by the UMC. But the contesting is very much like the Civil War, where the Union Army won, and we did nothing really to fix the problem of racism and class and caste in our country. And so we officially have these things, but how many, we've talked about this in the NNAL repeatedly, it's not being practiced. The bishops aren't embracing it, the people aren't embracing it, and so we won, but not really. So that contesting, you're also looking at what's the outcomes. It's really interesting to me.
And maybe sometimes the big battle is inevitable. I'm just.
And the other thread in here, working with the pilgrimage book Brother Dwight wrote. Food for Pilgrims, thank you. One of the things that really impacted me there, and I've been thinking about it deeply, is he talks about the primary sacraments as being nature and Christ, the paschal mystery of Christ, and holy connection. And what dawned on me then is early Methodists were really good at that, which caused everybody to have full conscious and active worship. in the primary sacraments in Methodist worship. And then we became more, we built our buildings and we walled ourselves in and we segregated ourselves and got more respectable, and we lost the full conscious and active, and we kind of lost, and as we were embracing the baptism and communion sacraments, we kind of lost those other primary sacraments. So just other interesting reflections there.
Brother Dwight.
As I've reflected on this, it seems to me that the great shift that takes place in '84, and I joined the order very shortly after that, was a shift from a focus on Anglican prayer book and structures, and therefore a great concern with rubrics, how to do it right, to the influx by the gift of the Spirit of Second Vatican Council, which becomes a gift to all of us, where the shift is not so much upon a fixed form as the, pardon the use of the term, the depth dynamic underneath that, which then gives rise to new forms but with historical roots. So we shift from a focus on rubrics to what we eventually, under Michael O'Donnell's leadership as abbot, come to think of as sacramental living. That's a huge shift. How do you do Eucharist right is one question. How to live Eucharistically is another. And that's a huge shift for people.
Now, I would just say it was there. I mean, the seeds of that are in the early rules.
Yes.
They really are. They didn't necessarily come to fruition until later on. But it's all there.
My one comment, and I'll claim the privilege of last comment, was that I'm wondering if the specific references to recognizable clerical garb really is not just the collar, but vestments in worship, because there was a common practice at that time for preachers to wear business suits.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking recognizable clerical stuff would have been robes and stoles.
And that shows up in 46 even.
Yeah.
You know, about gowns also. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brother Mark.